Welcome back. To touch more on the U.S. students' protest and the anti-Semitism bill, I also spoke with Sahar Mohamed Khamis, professor of communication at University of Maryland. So, Professor, in the past weeks, we have seen, more than 120 universities have witnessed student encampments and the protests, demanding a ceasefire in Gaza. I wonder, what's your observation of those protests, from campus to campus?
This is a very important historical moment. We have not seen this kind of huge scale students' protests in the United States since the 60s and 70s, since these students' protests against the war in Vietnam and also against racial discrimination policies against the blacks in the so-called civil rights movement. So therefore, this is really unprecedented since the 60s and 70s. And let me just say that it's not only national, it started to even go global and international. We started to see a ripple effect or a domino effect. And we started to see it spreading in Canada, in Britain, in France, in Australia, in other parts of the world. So it's not just an American phenomenon now, it's becoming a global phenomenon. These young people really are trying to raise their voices and say enough is enough. We have been witnessing and seeing and watching the killing of innocent civilians, especially young children, babies, women, elderly people, innocent civilians in Gaza, and this has to stop. We need ceasefire now, and we need the imposition of international law and the respect of human rights.
Some claim, the reason for removing the encampments and stopping the students' protests was because students were disrupting public order and, more importantly, chanting slogans which could be viewed as anti-Semitic. For example, like from the river to the sea. Also, earlier you mentioned about there is a red line. That is, if there are activities or slogans inciting violence, of course, that's a red line. Do you see, any kind of, I would say, there are, it would not be surprising if there are a couple of people who say things like offensive, that's probably anti-Semitic. But in general, what do you see? Do you see that's a reasonable demand, a reasonable protest there?
I think that, by and large, these protests have been largely peaceful. The students have been very respectful. They've been observing the law. They've not been creating any kind of havoc or disruption. In fact, the violence and the disruption was coming from the police. When the police started to enter some of these campuses, we saw in front of the cameras how some of the students have been beaten up or thrown to the ground. Even some of the faculty members, the professors, some of them have been treated badly. Some of them have been arrested or beaten in front of the cameras. So the violence here is coming from the police, not coming from the students themselves. As for the claim of anti-Semitism, unfortunately, that has been widely used in order to curb any kind of criticism of the government of Israel whenever a war happens in the Middle East. And of course, that's not the first time, unfortunately, that we have seen these kinds of conflicts in the Middle East and conflict and war on Gaza in particular. Every time this happens, there's always this claim of anti-Semitism. But let me tell you that 20 to 25% of the organizers of these protests are Jewish. That is a stunning number. And I heard that from a Jewish professor just a couple of days ago, and she assured me that this number is accurate. 20 to 25% of the protesters are Jewish. And many of the organizers of the protests also are Jewish. Groups like Jewish Voice for Peace and others who have been raising banners that says, we are Jewish, we cannot do this in our name. We are demanding an immediate ceasefire now. Let Gaza live. The people of Palestine have the right to exist and to have their own state and to have their own human rights respected. So it's very important to remind everyone of this particular fact, because how can that be an anti-Semitic movement when you have 20-25% of the organizers and the leaders of these movements, Jewish people, who are calling for the end of violence and calling for a ceasefire and calling for the protection of the human rights of the Palestinian people?
Yeah, good point. Still, amid the fury of the protests, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a controversial bill on May 1st, that expands the definition of anti-Semitism, very, I would say, a broad definition. The bill was initially released in October last year when the Gaza conflict broke out. How do you view the timing of the passing of the bill? Is the problem of anti-Semitism in the U.S. Really that serious that it is, probably needs a bill to crack down?
I will answer this question in two parts. Every time a conflict like that erupts in the Middle East, we do see a rise in both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in parallel. So yes, there are some, people who can be voicing some views that can be Islamophobic against all Muslims. And yes, there are some people who can voice also some views that can, broadly speaking, be considered quote unquote anti-Semitic. This is a fact. And this is something that we have to be aware of whenever a conflict erupts in the Middle East, especially if it's a conflict of the scale and the magnitude and impact that we are seeing and witnessing right now. However, having said that, when you're trying to pass a bill that tries to equate the criticism of the government of Israel and its actions with quote unquote anti Semitism, then that becomes a problem because that's going to curb the freedom of speech and freedom of expression that many of these students are peacefully expressing under the First Amendment to the Constitution. It's the right to express their views, let alone, of course, academic freedom. When you are on a university campus, that is supposed to be a place where academic freedom is sacred. You're supposed to express your views, express your opinions, speak freely, and be protected as well. So when that is disrupted or when that is threatened, that becomes a problem. And that's why, I am for the protection of all people, right? Everybody has to be protected. Everybody has to be safe. Everybody has to be free of offensive and hatred language and threats of violence or the use of violence. That is, of course, taken for granted. That is a given. The only problem here is the timing and also the intention behind the passing of such a bill in this particular moment of time, because, as I said, equating anti-Semitism with the criticism of Israel, that's where the problem lies.
Yes, so the purpose is basically, well, of course, on the surface is to protect the Jewish people in the United States. You mentioned about, of course, everybody needs protection or deserve protection in that sense. Do we have a similar bill, similar action to protect, let's say, Asians, let's protect like Africans, or given Islamophobia or Muslims in the United States?
That's a very good question. I'm glad you're asking this question because we have not seen a similar movement. Let's say, for example, to have some kind of legislation that would protect these groups and these minorities. Like, for example, during the pandemic, we have seen this, really insane rise in Asian hatred, right? And, people being called, they are, the cause of the virus, they're the cause for the pandemic. Asian people were feeling very unsafe. There were even incidents of violence that led, unfortunately, to the death of some people from Asian background. And we did not see an attempt to pass a bill to protect, for example, Asian minorities. We did not see a bill to protect African Americans. We did not see a bill to protect Muslims, for example, when they were subject to a lot of Islamophobia, and they're still subjected to a lot of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiments. Let's talk about the Muslim Travel Ban 1 and Muslim Travel Ban 2 during the time of former President Donald Trump, when he, issued this travel ban that basically banned, people from 6 Muslim majority countries from entering the United States. It had devastating effects on many families, tearing families apart. Some of them had critical medical conditions. They really needed to come to the United States for medical treatment, and they could not. They needed to be reunited with the families, and they could not. There was no attempt to pass a bill that makes it criminal to have feelings of Islamophobia or legislation of Islamophobia or anti-Muslim hatred and anti-Muslim bigotry. So definitely we are seeing here an example of double standards, I would say, because if you want to protect minorities, you want to protect groups, in my opinion, that has to be done equally to everyone. Whether you are Asian, whether you're African American, whether you're Jewish, or whether you're Muslim, you need to be protected against all forms of discrimination and hatred.
Yeah, I mean, freedom, it seems, at least if you look at what the U.S. officials, the government talked about, is valuable, is highly cherished by American people. And of course, in particular, for the young students, young faculty members, when they talk, they would very much to protect this kind of freedom, the rights to speak freely. And now, with the passing of the bill, with the backlash, or with the strong response from the police, the government there, do you think people have this kind of concern or even fear to speak out publicly, let's say, against Israel?
I think the opposite is happening. I think the opposite exactly is happening. I think that many of these young people have been encouraged to speak more and to express their views even more openly and more freely in a much more bold way, in an unprecedented way, like we said before. Like, you have seen students, holding the Palestinian flag, during the graduation ceremonies at different universities. You have seen encampments, you have seen wide protests, you have seen really huge support and solidarity. And let me remind you, it's not only about the students. We have seen also a lot of marches and demonstrations and protests in many capitals around the world, people going out in large numbers and huge numbers, raising the Palestinian flag and saying, enough is enough. These people also have the right to live freely and with dignity and respect like everybody else around the world, right? So I believe that really what we are witnessing is exactly the opposite. I don't see these young people backing away. I don't see them being silenced. I don't see them being intimidated. I see many of them very boldly and very courageously speaking up more and more because exactly they are scared of the taking away of these freedoms from them. So this battle or this whole protest is not really just only about Palestine or Gaza. It's much more than that. It's about human rights more broadly, and it's also about protecting the rights of free expression, academic freedom, and freedom of speech, which are very dear and near to every American citizen, especially young people in particular. So in my opinion, this is a movement not just in support of Gaza and Palestine, but more broadly, it's in support of human rights and also in support of freedom of expression and academic freedom and every other freedom which is protected under the American Constitution.
We know this is a time of graduation. Probably students will be leaving the campus and the protests will die down gradually. They are coming back in September, late August. Do you think there will be resumption of the protests on the campus?
Of course, let's hope and pray that the war does not continue until September. That's definitely the hope and prayer of everybody who's hoping for peace in this world, that we want to see the war end now, like right now, in order to save lives. We don't want to see more lives being lost. But in my opinion, it's not going to die down if the war continues until September. I think there's going to be a momentum going back again in the fall. Some of these students might regroup again. They might, try to gather again and create some kind of similar protests and some similar encampments and momentums on their own campus. Some of them may even use the summer period in order to, recharge and, think creatively about what needs to be done next. Some of them maybe had already graduated and now they're not students anymore, but they're really gonna provide some kind of support and solidarity for their own colleagues and their own friends who are still in the university and still are students in different campuses. So I really see it as a period of, trying to think creatively about the next steps and recharge their batteries and think about what to do next. But if the war continues, I think the protests will also continue and we're going to see it coming back again in the fall.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for speaking with us. With that, we come to the end for today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.